Hello, my name is David Prescott Barr. I was born on the 25th of June 1953 at the Royal Jubilee Hospital in Belfast. My mother is May McCune, then May Barr. You may know her as Maisie. My father was David Barr. 5 years ago my mother died, and she took with her the knowledge of the family interconnections. So I decided, with a little help from my friends, to try and piece together the family tree. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank those people who helped me. This photograph beside me is of my mother, taken in 1951, 60 years ago, in New York. And this photograph above me was taken 114 years ago in 1897, and that's of my grandmother, Emily McCune. Used to sit above my grandmother's chair, Granny McCune, in Cooper Street. And here's a little picture to show you. And the website will give you more details about me, my mother and my grandmother, and all of the family. And that's its purpose. Most of my childhood was spent in and around a townland in East Belfast called Ballyhackamore, and all the schools were close by. First of all, Greenwood, Strand Town, Cabin Hill, Campbell, and eventually I went to study physics at Queen's University. I went on to teach physics for some 11 years, then leaving that to follow up an interest in computer education. And this year, I retired. I remember going to visit my granny, usually on a Sunday, and we went into 203 Cooper Street, a very tiny house. By that stage she was in her 60s, and I have very fond memories of her spoiling me as a child, allowing me to take the biscuits or eat the sweets. Sadly, two of the McCune family died in the first few years of their life. John and Henry both died in the years before my mother was born. I didn't know all of my mother's siblings, but I knew quite a lot of them personally. William Robert unfortunately died before I was born, but the rest of the family I knew well. The eldest was Jimmy, James McCune. He was 54 years older than me, and yet when I got to that awkward age, teenage, when you don't take advice from your parents, because what would they know, he became my mentor, and many's an hour was spent discussing the various matters of the day. Sissy, who became Sissy Gorman, was the oldest girl, and I think she took charge. She certainly took charge of me when I visited, and I was allowed to do this but not allowed to do that. Lizzie was a very sweet lady, softly spoken. You had to keep quiet and lean in order to hear her. She was a seamstress, so she got all the jobs of altering clothes, shortening this, hemming that, repairing damage, and so on. Florrie, that's Florence McCune, I didn't really get to know very well, and she didn't go out to work like the other brothers and sisters, and I'm not too sure I know why, but she was the housekeeper. She tidied the house and made the meals and so on, and was very kind to me. But she was a very quiet girl, hardly spoke at all, would sit and be part of the company, but never speaking very much. Annie Patterson was probably the most independent of all of the family. She regularly visited Northern Ireland and stayed with my mum and my dad and myself. And on one occasion, it must have been coming up to December, I was probably about 10 or 11. I was struggling in the front room to parcel up a gift for Christmas, and she sat down with me for about an hour and taught me the correct way to package gifts. And she had I was going to say wicked, but that's probably not the right word. She had a sharp sense of humour. And although she was much older than my mum, they got on as if they were twins, as if they were meant for each other. They were bosom buddies. My mum worked as a nurse in the Belfast City Hospital, and then when I came along, she took time out to bring me up at least to school age, and then she went back to work. She had a very bad habit. If I come into the house after playing football with a scuffed knee and a bleeding wound, she would tenderly clean the wound, get out a little bandage, gently put the bandage on the wound, and had a terrible habit of giving it one final press. And that little press was sore, then I gave out a yell. But she couldn't resist that one final press. My father ran a wholesale grocery store based just off the Shankill Road in Agnes Street. He sold a variety of goods to storekeepers, shopkeepers, the sort of thing that you would buy before the age of the supermarket: cornflakes, peas, beans, sausages, etc. And as a child, it was a wonderland to wander around the store because it was full of sweets, and sometimes some of those sweets made their way out of the jars. I don't know how. But I'll take the fifth. One of the things as a child that annoyed me greatly is my middle name. So although people refer to me as David Barr, my middle name was Prescott. In actual fact, 5 people have middle names of Prescott. 5 people from my generation. And that's because my grandmother, Emily McHugh, I didn't call her Emily, I called her Granny McHugh, was previously, before her marriage, Emily Prescott. And so the name was passed on to the next generation. In actual fact, on the website, I've traced back the name Prescott to around about the beginning of the 1800s. And Alexander Prescott, who lived in County Monaghan, which is now in the south of Ireland, was a farm labourer. Cooper Street was very small indeed. If you stepped from the pavement, you went through a small gate, up a very short path to the door, then through a porch area to a second door. That second door would open onto the main living room. As you opened the door, immediately in front of you was the staircase. So if you were bringing something large into the house, like a set of step ladders, the head of the step ladders would probably have to go up the stairs to allow the foot of the ladders to enter the house. You would then close the door and bring the ladders into the room. So when somebody died in the house, and the tradition in those days was that the coffin and the body would remain in the house for visitors to come and pay their respects. But when the time came to bury the deceased, the coffin would be closed, taken to the front door, but part of it would have to go up the staircase to allow the door to be opened, and the coffin would then exit the house. Now what's peculiar about that is that inside the house was a piano, longer than a coffin, taller than a coffin, and very heavy. I have no idea how the piano got into the house. And indeed I don't know why, because to my recollection no one played the piano. Cooper Street was on what became known as the Peace Line, the dividing line between predominantly Catholic and predominantly Protestant housing areas. In 1969, when the violence began, unusually called the Troubles, a little bit of Irish understatement, my uncle and aunt, Jimmy and Lizzie, had to have the front window boarded up to prevent bricks or other items coming into the house. And my father did that. But I do have recollections of my Aunt Lizzie, who was probably in her late 60s, early 70s, going out onto the street, walking towards the rioting juveniles in order to try and convince them that they were doing wrong. One sad time is recorded on the BBC's website and perhaps on YouTube, which is called the burning of Bombay Street. That front window that I mentioned looked directly into the opposite street, which was Bombay Street. And in 1969, the residents were ousted from their houses by Protestants who set fire to their houses. A dreadful time in Ulster's history. I think my mother was responsible for keeping the connections alive. When her sister Annie Patterson went to the States and eventually ended up in Boonton, she would correspond by letter. In those days, far too expensive to ring and no such thing as the internet. By letter every single week. Either my mother wrote in week 1 and received a reply in week 2, and that went on and on and on. I hope through these videos that you will get some flavour of the various members of the family.